The idea that the American Civil Rights Movement was intended to advance global equality is largely unfounded when it comes to speaking of the NAACP. Adam Clayton Powell and others roasted King for his stand on the Vietnam War. Now, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC, which Martin Luther King, Ralph Abernathy, Diane Nash, James Bevel, and others associated with them, were leading a movement that equated human rights and civil rights, and many of them were considered to be held in mutiny against the patriotic fervor of being called to arms and proving themselves in service. Nativism, which means pride of place in America and the exclusion of immigrants, is actually rather strong among African Americans. This doesn't mean you can't tell a story, which is a true story, largely about Martin Luther King, in which the cause of the world, human rights, and the dignities due educated society, medical education, distribution of opportunity, protection from abuse. It's not absent in this story. The United Nations Charter, Martin Luther King, World Food Bank, there are Doctors Without Borders. There are people who commit themselves to work in these domains. The military-industrial complex has a grip on the economics of the situation. They have long argued that the first principles of survival of dignity, of human species' right to question, to understand, to own, to be paid for their labor and work, would be thrown down by hostile military factions if we didn't arm ourselves to protect ourselves from such intrusions. And to make this seem true, they invented enemies. They projected phobia, racism, religionism, hatred, where it was not and where it was not due. There were always reasons to try to understand, for example, North Korea. They had been brutally occupied by Axis Japan. There was no reason to just dismiss out of hand their fright and commitment to self definition. The whole world is being poisoned by the oil conglomerates who came up with, apparently, this business that Yoko Ono has promoted of an arc for our species, where equity is rationed to celebrities only. Important people only need apply. Schools, school buses, school busing, access to medicine, all of this has been blown up in Gaza, completely destroyed. Roger Waters pronounces himself a donor to the flag of Palestine while signing his name on the $1 million record contracts that glorify the destruction of schools, public schools. And he gets cheers. and he calls himself the Walrus. And of course, in the realm of super effete cyber garble, this has a ton of meaning to them. I don't buy any of that. If you were to ask me what I think should be done about African suffering, there are groups committed to the study and the mitigation of corruption in Africa. There are groups who are committed to, I think, a Makerere University, for example, holding a high standard of educated society as leadership in African society. I know that the civil rights movement was somewhat attacked and derailed by American guerrilla militancy. That's why I don't speak about it. I could tell you stories about the civil rights movement that inspired me, Black people who inspired me, but I would be browbeaten, heckled, followed around, abused, nightmarishly lied to and about, and insulted as not minding my place. That's not a white man's place to tell those stories. And of course, there are junctures where they have covered up working with the extreme right wing like Ronald Reagan on a brutal, cruel, incendiary assassination of me. And they've covered it up. So there's not much I can say. I could tell the story as it is told to a certain point and then part ways because the storytellers impinge on the persona's experience, to use their words, and put me places I never was, doing things I didn't do, and completely ignoring the evidence and symptoms and testimony of torture. I don't understand what's wrong with them. They place me in a genocide mentality framework because I'm white. They say I'm just 2 centuries away from having been a slave owner. That's really not fair to my family. Plymouth Meeting had people who said, ask the Native Americans before you pitch a tent on their property. My family was in Plymouth Meeting. I've never heard anything wrong about them. My father in the 1940s put out a book on human rights. My mother made a stand in Topeka in the 50s for her right to sleep in a Negro man's bed if she so chose. It was not a very popular position for her to take. And yet, despite the fact that the Craries have never been goblins of the ultra-right, at least I have never been, I've been tarred and painted by Pittsburgh child pornographers to amuse terrible, terrible gangsters from groups like the Pittsburgh Courier who refuse to recognize the truth of the horrible ordeals that I was put through as a child. Despite all the evidence, they sit on envelopes of evidence and completely construe what they have in their files as the absolute opposite of what it obviously is, evidence of torture by child pornographers. It's perfectly obvious what those archives contain. They refuse to say anything rational about it. And they side with these white people who go ripper killing people over a penny because of some absurd idea of profiteering. If the slave wants a penny, you lynch him. I don't understand how any of this is possible, but I'm certainly not going to feed into it. You think I'm going to come kneeling and scraping to UW Africa? Get a life. You've made your decision when it comes to me. Leave someone you've tortured alone. Show at least some sense and dignity. You talk about domestic abuse. You make breathing wrong, pushy. Show some spirit of your consistency and leave someone you've lied to alone. Leave someone you've hated and abused and rejected alone.